Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion on social justice and international education, Afrophobia and Anti-Blackness in international education. By continuing to be in this meeting, you are consenting to being recorded. When not speaking, please keep your microphone muted. For technical issues, please message our tech lead, Gloriana Felix. Thank you to our sponsor. Today's session has been sponsored by the Hillsborough Community College. Thank you, Hillsborough Community College. Today's session is the fourth in a series of social justice dialogues being hosted by NAFSA Region 7. Dr. Keshia Abraham was a contributor to the recent NAFSA publication edited by Dr. LaNitra Berger and entitled Social Justice in International Education, Research, Practice, and Perspectives. Our social justice dialogues have been highlighting different chapters and essays, and we are delighted to have Dr. Abraham discuss her essay and to hear from her partners at Ulwazi, Africa. Dr. Keshia Abraham is the founder and president of the Abraham Consulting Agency, where she helps people use their agency to make positive social change in education abroad and beyond. A gifted educator, speaker, writer, and facilitator, Dr. Abraham presents extensively on education abroad and aspects of African diaspora literature and culture, and has lived and worked in over 40 countries. Dr. Abraham earned a PhD in comparative literature with an emphasis on post-colonial literature and popular education at Binghamton University. Her bachelor's degree in English with an emphasis on women's studies was at the esteemed Spelman College. Professionally, she has served as a tenured faculty member, department chair, program director, academic dean, most proudly at an HBCU. Among other awards, this two-time Fulbright Fellow is currently in her second term on the Forum Council. She is co-editor of the forthcoming book, The Half Yet to Be Told, Study Abroad at HBCUs. Ronel E. Stevens is the co-presenter, is one of the three co-founders of Ulwazi Africa. With over 15 years experience in the South African public tertiary sector, Ms. Stevens is a savvy manager with in-depth knowledge and understanding of international higher education exchange programs. Ms. Stevens has demonstrated history of successfully working with university students from all over the globe on short-term exchanges and internships on the African continent, and has a proven capability in the design and implementation of creative and community-facing service learning projects. She's a master's in laws graduate, specializing in human rights law, a child protection officer, and an international development specialist focused on education. She's also an NGO impact analysis and intercultural learning through engagement, bridging the gap that exists between academy and communities. Angela Mais is one of the three co-founders of Ulwazi Africa and is an international education and community-based learning practitioner and facilitator who is passionate about global education. She specializes in service learning and believes it to be paramount for teaching and learning. Ms. Mais has more than 30 years experience in community upliftment, having started out as a ballet teacher in underserved communities after graduating from the University of Cape Town Ballet School. Ms. Mais has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Psychology and Sociology from the Nelson Mandela University, and she has engaged communities on all levels and across the cultural divide of a previously apartheid society. Her work with international students, universities, and communities has firmly established an extensive network and connections for sustained engagement. She has directed, designed, facilitated, coordinated, and managed international higher education study abroad programs for the most part of the past 18 years. I am looking forward to learning and the discussions that will take place today. And I would now like to turn this over to Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham?
Thank you so much, Sharmila. Thank you so much to all of you who had a hand in making today an event that I think we're all looking forward to, an opportunity for us to connect across spaces, across locations, across disciplines and perspectives. I want us to start on my end. I want to thank you especially for everyone for contributing to the word cloud, which you will see a little bit later. We have quite a few surprises planned for you as we move through this discussion today. I'm going to give you a little bit of the kind of lay of the land of our discussion. And I want to start that by first doing something that I think is very important, which is grounding ourselves from a traditional cultural standpoint. So we did not get here alone, right? None of us got here alone today. We enter this conversation on the backs of ancestral light workers, scholars, activists who worked tirelessly against Afrophobia even before we knew to name it. So as I call out the names of some of our collective intellectual ancestors, feel free to add names to the chat. Angela, Ronel, you'll feel free to chime in. I want to start by saying I give thanks to Nella Larson, Marcus Garvey, Franz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, Louise Bennett, Stephen Biko, Ellen Kuzweo, Robert Sobukwe, Bela Kuti, June Jordan, Tony Cade Bambara, Audre Lorde, Mariama Ba, Chinua Achebe, Buchi Emecheta, Kamal Brathwaite, Toni Morrison, Brother Resistance, and Chief Leroy Clark of Trinidad and Tobago, who went home to the ancestors just yesterday. I also give thanks to my grandparents and my parents, Henrietta and Gregory Abraham, who are in the realm of the ancestors. Ronel, Angela, any names you'd like to add?
Angela, if you're happy to go ahead, please do go ahead. Because I'm also in the space where I have to recognize my elders in this space. So please, Angela, you go ahead. Maybe while Angela is trying to connect, I'll call out a few names. The E in my name is for Edna, which is my grandmother. My mother, Veronica Stevens. I'd like to call on my other grandmother, Margaret Stevens. I'd like to call on all of my aunts, and I can call them by name, but I know they know who they are, and they've taught me who I am. And I'd like to honor all of the very strong women that had presented space and opportunity for me, but also I'd like to recognize the positive men who had been in my life. And I see one of them on the call, so I'd like to call out Quentin Redcliffe. And I also would like to recognize those who are present here with me. My daughter, who physically can't be here, but I know is always 100% physically present, Aquila Stevens. And I also want to call on my sister, Cherie Stevens. And for me, it's about recognizing those not only who had passed, but those who had prayed for a future that we never thought could be imagined for me. And for me, living it and, you know, being able to fully kind of step into that light. And also as I paid forward to those who I am connecting to. So welcome and thank you again for creating the space.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. I would just like to give credit to Quentin Redcliffe, my ex-boss, who I saw was online. And thanks to Quentin for giving me the amazing opportunity that you did previously when I was working for CIEE. Thanks. I'm done. I'm good.
Wow, so I didn't anticipate that happening in that way. And I'm going to give some thanks to my brother Quentin Radcliffe too, because I can't have y'all give him all the, all the praise without acknowledging as well. Mad love to you, my brother. I'm so grateful that you're here. It's especially important as we go into talking about this essay in particular. So let's keep moving. And we were going to now kind of talk through some of the foundational concepts that are in this book, in this essay. And we're going to be sharing with you a little later the results of that word cloud. So just hold on to that. We know that it's there. We'll be coming back to it. And so I'm going to just kind of take us through this a little bit. I won't be reading directly what's on the slide, but you'll look at it and it's saying something similar to what I'm going to share. And so that is one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is Afrophobia in Afrotopia, right? Like, what is Afrophobia? What do we mean by that? What is Afrophobia? Afrophobia is the fear of a specific other, a Black other. Afrophobia is having an internal mental debate about what to wear when traveling to certain locations, especially in Europe, not wanting to look too African because of how you might be treated. Afrophobia is expecting the security guard will follow you around the store, even though you entered at the same time as a group of loud, young, white high schoolers in the middle of the day. And he does, and you are in Russia. Afrophobia is being stared at everywhere. Afrophobia is nations adapting with ease to China in Africa sans critique, and watching and waiting while employment, ownership, and major projects that fundamentally change Indigenous communities are erected quietly all over the place and without visible African leadership or control in Africa. So you leave Senegal for a US education and take Chinese for your language requirement to increase your chances of securing work when you eventually return home. Afrophobia is distinct from xenophobia because it's not general hatred, but something very specific to violence against people of African descent. And it is not exclusive to South Africa, despite what it may seem like to some of you right now because of who's giving this talk today. It is not exclusive to South Africa. It lives on a spectrum that includes the popular manifestations we see on lists of potential microaggressions to fatal, blatant, daily catastrophes. Afrophobia is creating barriers to this specific work such that even this essay had to be written in deep secret because where I was working previously to my liberation, I was told that there was a concern about me focusing too much on Black people in preference rather, for erasing our unique history, for preference of literally whitewashed versions of identity. Afrophobia is a belief system. It is a worldview which keeps people of African descent all around the world at odds with each other, and most often with ourselves. Afrophobia maintains conflict amongst people who only lose by remaining at odds with one another. Angela, Ronel, what do you guys think? What is Afrophobia to you? What are some of the thoughts that you have about this?
I'm here.
Please, you go ahead, Angela.
Sorry, I missed that. What did you? Sorry, I just had to go somewhere to switch on the heater. I'm freezing.
No worries, no worries. I was asking you all to go ahead and share with us some of your perspectives on Afrophobia. I've just given a range of them to kind of launch this part of the discussion, and I'd like for you to share your interpretations, definitions, perspectives on Afrophobia.
Well, you've just about, can you hear me? You've just about covered everything, but you know, when we were speaking last week and I started thinking about Afrophobia, I thought of, I had to it's the xenophobic attacks came to my mind, you know, when back then when we had those that terrible time with the xenophobic attacks. And I came across an interview where Maletsi Mbeki, the former President Thabo Mbeki's brother, was being interviewed by a journalist. And the interesting thing is that this journalist opened the discussion by asking Mr. Mbeki, so what is it? Is it Afrophobia? Is it xenophobia? Or is it criminality?
Mm.
And I was like, wow. Whilst Afrophobia is not as obviously criminal, xenophobia is. But Afrophobia is not too far off. And what authorities aren't paying too much attention to exactly that aspect of Afrophobia. So yes, I think that is my introduction to my thoughts concerning Afrophobia.
Perfect, Ronel.
If I can step in, I just actually came from dinner and we had a conversation about having the conversation about Afrophobia. And I was in a space where it was complete, like I was surrounded by only white South Africans speaking in Afrikaans, you know. And I was saying I'm doing this presentation. And the one person asks me not what the definition of Afrophobia is, because they immediately could make the connection. But they asked me a question about what is the opposite of Afrophobia? And I asked, what is it? You know, but my immediate response to that was two things. I was like, you can either think about it as Pan-Africanism or you can think about it as humanity. In both ways, there's a win. And so I think when I have to ponder about Afrophobia and I have to think about the word, it's actually a word that came across in very recent rhetoric for me. And so recent as 2008, when in South Africa, the media had coined what had been happening in the country as xenophobic attacks. So attacks of African nationals in our country by Black South Africans. And at the time, of course, we can only speak about narratives that lives very close to us and narratives that we know. So my narrative is that I was at the time dating a Tanzanian superstar, essentially. The kind of superstar that had, you know, his face on the side of a car, that kind of superstar. And the fear that he had about living in Cape Town was not a fear that he just carried for himself or that his parents had carried for him, being in this space where this was happening, regardless of the fact that he was living in a very affluent neighborhood, of course, and driving a beautiful car. Because we have this idea that Afrophobia exists in a specific class. It doesn't. And so his fear was not just limited to the experience that everyone was worried he was having or the fear of his life, but also the fear of my life because I was in association and whatever that could mean, because whoever was going to bring the violence was not going to ask questions. I think about Afrophobia. I think about how people who, like me, are registered as colored in this country and still being called the K word within the context of the people who are also registered as colored, or cousins who would meet me at family gatherings and say, "Here's my African cousin," as if we are not connected in any ways, not blood, not association. And so Afrophobia to me has become very personal because it's not just a thing that's out there. I think xenophobia makes you feel like it's a thing that's out there. But when it's Afrophobia, when it's almost that discussion that no one really wants to have. Because usually when the Afrophobia is also set, it's set as a black-white narrative. But that's not also always the case. And I think in South Africa particularly, we are very polarized in so many different ways. Sometimes people want to water down what that actually looks like in this space. But tensions, I mean, it would actually be very facetious of me if I were not to mention what had happened just about 2 weeks ago when we had an eruption of not Afrophobia, but things that leads to that level of violence and that
Yeah.
level of having to
Yeah.
deal with racial tensions
Mhm.
within a space that has for 27 years, and no, 27 years, the same amount of years that someone who had liberated this country had spent in prison, Tata Nelson Mandela.
Mhm.
That same amount of time spent as a democracy, but
Right.
still dealing with the hangover of hate,
Right.
fear. And so Afrophobia is a very complex conversation. And I really hope that part of what we are able to do here is almost start opening that can of worms, because we want it to be uncomfortable. We want it to be an important discussion, but we also want it to be a continuous discussion. And
Yeah.
so I hope that in some of my kind of initial comments, it really is just arousing more opportunity for conversation, because there is so much to discuss
Yeah.
as it relates to this.
And those conversations need to be done respectably.
Mm.
Mhm.
Mm.
Mhm.
The one thing I would actually say, if you don't mind,
No, no, no.
Dr. Keshia and Angela, is
Mhm.
also this constant tie to the colony. So whenever
Uh-huh.
there's a discussion about Afrophobia, the conversation is, oh, because of apartheid, and it is actually a conversation that is important to have, but it's also a conversation that we need to think about, where does that conversation exist?
Yeah.
Again, it's like that black white narrative.
You're
I think
right.
it's so important that we start having those conversations in other spaces, not allowing the colony to determine what that conversation looks like
Yeah.
and sounds like, and the
Right.
words and the languages that we use for it, but
Yeah.
also to have a conversation where we actually try and push the benchmarks of how that happens in a space that can be comfortable for those who are experiencing it in a very personal way as well. And
Mhm.
I would say in this context, it would be Black people, Africans connected to the diaspora, to the continent in some way or sense, but also to understand how that happens in other spaces as well.
Yeah.
Afrophobia may be very specific to experiences that Black people have, but it would be interesting to also have an understanding: is there iterations of it happening when Chinese people or Asian people travel, for example, and what that experience looks like. This is not the platform for that, but what I
How
do
it
want to
manifests.
kind of like point at is that Afrophobia feels for me like a very specific conversation we wish to have, and that we need to have. But I also think that it needs to be honored for what needs to be discussed and how it needs to be discussed in the context.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that a
Absolutely.
big piece of that is caught up in the question that you asked in the beginning, which is something that my work is usually moving into, which is so much
Yeah,
more about like, but what do we do now? Like, but who are we
yeah,
now? And how
yeah,
do we use our agency to actually change that, right? And
yeah,
what are
yeah.
the things that have to happen in between? So much of that, I think that's also kind of what you're getting at in terms about the colonial relationships, is so much of that has to do with choices that we make with our liberation, right?
Mhm.
So what do we understand about what that liberation needs to include? What does it mean to our forms? What does it mean to how we show up? How do we show up in space, right? Do we tell our
Mhm.
students that you
Mm.
all must wear a Western suit and tie, and I'm probably supposed to have on somebody's jacket or some buttons or something, or maybe a lapel pin, and I don't know, something, some straight hair, something. That's not my hair. My hair doesn't grow straight. So, and we're in conversations
Or
around the
down.
right, or down, right? This doesn't go anyway, it goes out like yours, right? And and we recognize that as much as we have to, in order to survive, make
Yeah.
light of the dark, of what is dark and heavy in that discussion, there's also so much of this in the public discourse that we have agency to make change in. You see things now, like in the US recently, they passed this thing called the Crown Act, which is wonderful, that there's legislation that now says that people aren't ought not discriminate against Black women or men who decide to keep our hair natural. But why are we having that conversation in the first place? It's your hair. It's what grows on your head. So how is it that that becomes a reasonable conversation? But it must be, because for so long, even into our liberations around the world, recognize, I'm saying that law recently passed in the US. There's not a law like that right now in South Africa, right? There's not a law like that right now in Jamaica. There's not a law like that right now in England. There's not a law like that right now in France that absolutely protects the integrity of your body as a Black person moving through space, right? So there
It's
is the decision.
dehumanizing.
Right, right. And what happens when we are not necessarily preparing our students for all that comes with that in the spaces that they're entering as they're moving through the world in an international context, right? Because these things are shifting in different locations. When I want to kind of open this more, but I'll just say, I live in Miami, right? So I live in obviously the sun. I live in Miami, and this is my neighborhood is a very predominantly Haitian neighborhood in a lot of ways. And there's still so many things that people say here that is derogatory about people of Haitian descent. And when I say people, what people say that is derogatory, I mean predominantly people of African descent of some sort, African American and other people of African descent, other Afro-Caribbeans. All kinds of things. When tragedy happens in Haiti, there are all kinds of really negative things that happen and it gets said without thinking about why. Why is there such a preoccupation, right, with what is considered to be negative in a place that is the first liberated nation in the West, right? And why is it that the things that are negative all are at the root of what is understood as their Africanity?
Sadly. Well, to come, since you mentioned students, there sometimes we have thought that as students arrive, it's almost as though they have, and no offense to anybody in international education, it's as if students back home have been prepared to be Afrophobic, and for all good intent and purposes. But then we sit with the problem, us who are on the receiving end, have to almost like, because Afrophobia it's not innate, it's learned behavior. So they've learned it somewhere. So maybe just, as they were being prepared, over and above what they've already learned about their perceptions of Africa, they've heard certain things that's totally out of context concerning what they're going to experience. But that's all good and well, because now they're with us and we can help them. However, it's entirely up to the student. It also depends on that student's mental state upon arrival. That will actually determine the entire experience. I mean, a lot of students want to come to Africa for various reasons, but they have this irrational fear based on preconceived perceptions about Africa. But of course, they're also very daring and they want to engage. And those fears will hamper their engagement with locals. It will hamper the learning process. So I think we sometimes also need to ask ourselves, what role are we playing in this entire Afrophobic arena?
Definitely.
And not just and maybe look deep within ourselves. The map, the word cloud that you used earlier works so well for when students arrive, because we do it on day one. That one. We do it on day one when they arrive. This is our orientation. We don't say a word. It's up on the screen, and they walk in. We don't say anything. As they settle down, they look at this, and it gets them thinking. So I wouldn't be surprised if, or rather, it's I'm hoping that those who are participating tonight might also have maybe been touched by our own conflicts concerning Afrophobia, even ourselves. Have we just stood by and watched this happen? How did we maybe contribute to the problem? I think it's time that we look deep in ourselves and try and see, because we've all got conflicts within us, and Afrophobia is just one of such conflicts, and it could be sitting there. It's become part of life. So the question is, what are we going to do about this? Because it cannot carry on. Like I said earlier, I was shocked when the word criminality came up with Afrophobia, but of course xenophobia is criminality. I mean, it is criminal. But
so is Afrophobia. It's
Yeah.
like, I mean, it's dehumanizing, it's an insult, it's an attack on our person. So something needs to be done about it. And especially since, you know, in education, in international education, where students are engaging and going all over the world. I mean, Africans encounter this outside of Africa and vice versa. Um, Maybe institutions should also start thinking about what role they might have played in all of this, and really dig deep and do some introspection and see maybe historically where did all we know where it started, but did we actually contribute to it, or did we just stand by and do nothing?
Right.
And if so, we are here now having this discussion, so we can do something about it and have discussions like these regularly, openly, and just keep talking about it. But something needs to be done to break down these preconceived perceptions and ideas of what Africa is all about, and all her beautiful people, you know.
Yes. Yes.
So so yeah.
Yeah, that's
um
absolutely it, Angela. And I love how you've set us up for going into the discussions. Like that's the work that
Exactly.
you're all about to do.
yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and I'll just give a quick example of that too. Even, I mean, one of the words we use that's so common in international education, this is an example of a thinking shift that you might want to consider in your breakout rooms. What is the word we usually use? Underrepresented destinations, right?
Yeah.
Right? Underserved destinations. We use often terms like, you know, unusual destinations, the off the beaten the path. So we're still kind of in a Conrad kind of heart of darkness, right? Kind of idea about sending students to the largest continent on Earth. So in your breakout rooms, here are your instructions. We're going to ask you, we're going to work with the time a little bit here, a little bit, again, culturally sensitive around our time. So we are going to ask you to discuss, have one person to present back on the question, how do international educators address Afrophobia around the world? Our intention is that you'll be in groups, 3 groups. That's our intention. But let's see how our numbers have shaken out.
Yeah.
And you should find yourselves just magically floating into communities of people to discuss this with.
So just to remember that you have to think about what does Afrophobia mean and how it plays out in international education. And also just think about the one person out of those 3 groups that will be representing the group in some of the discussions. Um, yeah, it's going to be very important to try and have a very concise
Yeah.
conversation and try and come up with some concrete feedback with such little time.
So the groups have been assigned. Please jump on in there. We'll be here when you come back. Great, 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 great. Welcome. Okay, so now you're coming back, and I hope, let's see, let's use some emojis. Let's use some reactions. How were the conversations in your groups? Will you throw some reactions in there? Use some of the little reactions on the bottom. It was great. Maybe clap if you liked it. Thumbs up, heart, some emojis. Even if it was difficult, we can take the laughter and the tears there. As you're coming in, you're seeing on the screen the word cloud that you created. These are your words. This is what we entered the conversation talking about, thinking about in relation to Africa and what Afrophobia might be. What are some of the concerns that we have? And so our intention is to share some conversations from your discussion groups. And what we want to do is really synthesize those, really make them as concise as possible. So we're going to ask that, I'm going to be super strategic, hopefully, about this. And what I want to ask is group number 2. I don't know who's in which group, so I don't think I'm picking any favorites. I'm not. But group number 2, can you just give us a quick kind of synopsis of what you think the highlights are that you're going that came out of your conversation in terms of things people can actually do, people might actually embrace around making a change with regard to how we address Afrophobia in our work. Group 2, who's our speaker? Introduce yourself when you come in and just drop us 3 key points. I am that teacher who calls on the person. So come on in, group 2.
We
and you
recommend
may not
you use
know.
speaker view if you are, so that you can see the speaker. And please, if you're speaking, unmute yourself before you speak and introduce yourself.
I think I am the speaker of the group 2. I just cannot remember if it is group 2 or which one
You
it
are,
was.
Minu. You are, Minu.
Okay.
We are group 2.
Marvelous. I trust you, Minu. I trust you. You got this. Let's hear
It's
it.
Yeah. Okay.
Marvelous.
I'm Minu, and I am the Director of International Programs at Methodist University. I think yes, I think these discussions are difficult, and I think that is to acknowledge for sure, especially as educators. So I cannot imagine how students feel. And one of the things that there were multiple great points that were brought up during the sessions, but I'm going to start with the last one, where there's conversations about using working with study abroad advisors to equip them and empower them with information so that they can either provide study abroad trips that go to different types of African countries. And when that happens, how can you empower the students to try and see what that looks like in a completely different light than what the stereotypical light would be of either going and serving in some capacity or looking at it as this exotic place, but to see for its culture, literature, and things of that sort. And I think one of the things Alejandra talked about was using the host communities to help empower and curate this information, rather than just thinking that this is what we should be doing. And maybe also using the students that are within the university who are from African nations who come, to use them as well. So that's something that we talked about. The other thing is that if the staff is not educated, and if the staff is not using the right words and the right languages, then the students will probably not do it or not know how to go about it. So that was another topic that was brought up. So how can we educate ourselves? And we do those things ourselves. You know, there are times when we stereotype or blanket certain types of students just right away. And how can we use those words and how we can have those discussions? And it seems like, you know, some university reps talked about how they have a program coordinator in the host country. They have they have trips going to countries in Africa, but that's not a lot of them. And I acknowledge my institution as one of them, that we do not have one. We have difficulties sending students abroad, period. And then students have, and you know, they already are very anxious about going abroad, and on top of that, they're even more anxious to go to a country that they are completely different from. And to break that mold in these formative years for them, I think that's the big challenge as student advisors. So that's what we had talked about.
Excellent work, Minu and Group 2. Y'all did some fantastic work. And I'm watching from the faces that there was commonality in some of the other groups and some of the other conversations. I want to add a couple of things to what you said really quickly. And I think you just hit on so many really brilliant points. One of the things is like who and how do you do this work? You're calling folks like us who are here trying to do this work and making sure that we have that support. Both myself, Angela, Ronel, like we work together in a lot of different projects. There are lots of us out here doing this work. We do specifically mentoring services in particular and other kind of courses and things so that we can really start to change the way that we think about it. Some of that thinking even has to do with locations that we think students may feel more familiar with, right? So what are the narratives of Afrophobia in Europe? How do we deal with what students are not thinking about when they consider empire, right? We go to London, we can go to London, I love London. But when I go to London, I start off in Brixton because I need to get grounded in my authenticity when I go to London. I need to connect with some fufu. Actually, I saw lots of fufu on that chart. I need to eat some fufu when I get to London. So I feel like, all right, I reach. But everybody's different in this, right? So y'all did a great job. I know that we are at time, a little bit at time. I also know that my people move with the sun. So if you people move with the sun and you have a little bit of flexibility in your time and space, we invite you to stay with us, hang in it. and we're going to continue the conversation. We're also going to ask you to throw a little bit in the chat. We won't stay much longer, I promise. You can also throw some of what your groups talked about in the chat so that we don't lose track of anything. This has been so vital to make sure that we really understand what people have been talking about, right? We have this other word cloud, and I'm going to give it over to Angela quickly is Angela or Ronel? I forgot who's going to do this one. I'm sorry. To talk a little bit about the context of these two word clouds you saw.
Ronel.
You're right, Ronel. I'm sorry, Angela. And then Ronel will talk about it a little bit. And it's like Ronel. And then we're going to go back a little bit into some more of the conversations from your groups very quickly. So go ahead, Ronel. The context again for this one.
Yeah, just absolutely. And very quickly, thank you for the feedback that we also received from the groups. And I can see in the conversation,
amazing feedback,
the words people shared, there's already a lot of thinking. And of course, you know, these kind of conversations call people who are interested in having these conversations generally. So how we have used this and the previous word cloud in the past, Angela mentioned that we do it in orientation. We put out that first one. And if you remember, and I'm going to go back, if you remember, the one before is one that speaks about poverty, but in a way that talks about the space as a negative space, right? And then you go and we say, but that's not the only thing that you will experience when you come to the space. And when students leave our programs and they leave the experience, they can speak about this. They can speak about the beauty, they can speak about the diversity, they can speak about the culture, but they don't speak about it as a monolith. They speak about the complexity of this beauty, the complexity of this diversity, the complexity of the culture. Friendly, when can you trust that? When can't you trust that? You know, and it's like it becomes, I wouldn't say a lived experience, but it really does shift lenses from what you thought you would experience to what you could be experiencing if you open yourself up to that. And so we use this as a tool to help students discuss. There's a few other tools that we use, but we were actually toying with for the breakout groups, for example. So I don't know if folks are familiar with DIE, describe, you know, interpret, evaluate. So how would you think about that when you have a discussion around diversity, equity, Afrophobia, Blackness? And so this is kind of our encouragement, but this is actually research that has been done with people who had come, perceptions before arriving on a study abroad program, and then perceptions after having been on the study abroad program. Thank you,
and
Dr.
if I can just add, and it's not as simple as just, so when they arrived, they thought it was all those negatives and, oh wow, it's all so beautiful at the end of the program. What happens in between, it's how we manage the program that will bring them to this. To understand, it's how the programs actually manage, how you're managing the student, especially the you know, after all, it's a journey they're on, so it's quite an emotional journey, and the management of the actual student and what the student is experiencing is very important. And that is, it's one way that we try and curb incidents. And since we're speaking about Afrophobia, because remember, they come with preconceived ideas and perceptions, and they're out in the field where we're not with them. So, but we have to, any perceived experiences or incidents, we have to nip it in the bud immediately. Otherwise, it could flare up. And that is part of the experience. So one negative experience could actually spoil the student's entire, semester. So when I say it's the key is in the management of the program and helping them get a deeper understanding, because they could come on a program in and out and just miss it, if you know what I'm saying. So it's important that we try and change perspectives and do so in a manner that, you know, it will stay with them, it will resonate with them. We want them to leave with a very positive story to tell.
Yes. Absolutely. And that is what it's about, right? The story that we tell, the stories that we change, the stories that we change, and the stories that we tell. I'll just quickly note that there are a few really wonderful questions and concepts that are in the chat. And I want to just highlight, there was a particular one around student engagement. How do you engage students who are already struggling to have these conversations, and what do you do? There was also a suggestion, and I love that the person, well, it's difficult because the person said, oh, but maybe it's a silly idea. It's not a silly idea at all. About using a map of Africa and getting people to kind of identify where's what. And I would say that that exercise is something I've done many times with students in the past. It's important to do it with them because you don't know them all either. You don't know the countries. Most people, I'm gonna say most people, some of us do, but most people don't. And so one of the things that we have to always remember when we stand in the space of this work is that we are all learning. We are all growing. We all have the capacity to do it. The students have the capacity to understand it, and we have the capacity to do it. But we have to also stand in the space of the discomfort of not knowing sometimes and share that space also to move forward together, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so in the interest of everyone's time as we move forward together, I'm gonna have just ask y'all for some final quick words.
Who are you speaking to now?
Either you or Ronel, I think, yeah.
Okay.
So,
okay, Ronel. Okay. I think, you know, I like some of the questions that came up, especially getting information from the host country for your orientation of students, because that will really help a lot. So in other words, we need to participate in what you are telling the students back home. So it sounds almost like there's some kind of training that might be needed for program advisors. And I like that because I think it's by time. And yes, this is a very difficult discussion. Race is always it's not easy to speak about, but it needs to be spoken. We need to have conversations about it. Someone said that we are actually the role models, and yes, you are. And that's what I meant about the conflict. We have conflicts within ourselves, and we don't know how we've actually transferred that to the students we work with. So maybe we actually played that role in telling the student, oh gosh, when you walk down Long Street, remember not to look at a black man in the eye because he will see it as you coming on to him. You know, stuff like that. I mean, that's for real.
It hasn't worked for me.
Yeah. So it's all about equipping and empowering both, not only program advisors, but also so that program advisors can then empower students before they come. But let me assure you that students who come on our program are taken care of. We really love what we do, first of all, and we're absolutely passionate about what we do. So what you haven't done, we will ensure that it does happen. So send them on our service learning programs. Just before I sign off, the takeaway for me, which we've already spoken about, is we need to find ways to some constructive ways to break down these perceptions. So it's about effecting change, we need to change attitudes and mindsets, because and this historically, I mean, this has been going on for forever. So it's not going to be easy, but here tonight we've had this discussion, and I think this is a good place to start. So we in ourselves, you know, can start making a difference. And as I said earlier, I think institutions really need to also start thinking about what role they are playing in this Afrophobic arena.
Yes,
you know,
yes,
so
absolutely.
there's a lot of unpacking that needs to be done in order to move forward.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you both so much.
I have one more comment, if I may.
Yes.
I think one thing that is very important when we have any conversation, because any conversation could be a difficult conversation, but I think one of the things we can rely on is if you know that you have a toolbox that has all of the resource people, words, concepts, scenarios, that really does empower you, because you're like, oh, the light is not working. Let me go and fetch the globe. Do I have a toolbox?
Right.
Or I have a screwdriver.
Right.
And I think that is really important as you start thinking about how are you mapping the way forward. And I think something very important, which is also maybe not even discussed in this conversation, is what has this hybrid online, offline life
Girl.
meant for those who cannot connect? Because we have this assumption that everyone can connect. And mostly the assumption is that everyone in America can connect.
And
But
that's
is that the
true.
truth? We know that for fact. Angela and I are connecting from I'm now literally in the reception of my staycation because my internet wasn't working in my room.
I'm at home.
But technology, you know what I mean? We
Yeah.
rely so heavily on that, or the assumption of going back to normalities. That's something that we all can move to. And I think that is part of this deeper conversation about limitations and experiences that we may not all understand, but having to think about how those play out.
Yeah.
Students who want student loans that are studying abroad, they
Mhm.
can't go out and drink every night. Not that we
Mhm.
want them to do that, but
Right.
you know, the experiences are just completely different.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it's having that
Yeah.
mindfulness. That's
Right.
all we can depend on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And front loading that mindfulness, right? Starting from a place from the very beginning
Yes.
of recognizing that we all have assets to offer. We all come from valuable, rich cultures that are engaging in this work together. And so we're shifting all the deficit models, we're shifting all of the limitations and moving into a place of saying, this is how we consult our own agency as we make change as a collective of allies, supporters, people here to do this work with you. So you have contact information there for both of us, all of us. And we do hope that you do get in touch. We want to be able to make sure that we are of service, all three of us, work in a way that is about support. I work obviously for myself, with myself, and for our community, specifically for our community, with no specific allegiances or acknowledgement to any particular location or program provider, anything like that, except to say that I work for those who are about making change for all of us. And so with that, I want to thank all of you so much for giving us this opportunity. I want to thank you, NAFSA Region 7, my old region, technically here in Miami still, right? I want to thank y'all so much for embracing this work. That was a real labor of love and quite a lift when it first came about. And so I'm grateful to see it all kind of manifesting in this way. Thank you all for your support. And I'm turning it back over to Sharmila now to close us out.
Thank you, guys.
Just a few points in closing. A big thank you to Dr. Keshia Abraham, Ronel Stevens, and Angela Mize for sharing all this immense wealth of knowledge and, you know, starting this conversation. And thank you to all of you for being such an engaged audience, for engaging in this very important dialogue with the presenters and with one another. But we request you not to let the end of this session stop you from continuing this conversation. Please continue this conversation. It is truly important conversation, not only to have with the presenters, but also with other international educator colleagues and within your state region and, you know, wherever you can. So please do continue that. Also remember to submit an evaluation of today's session. It will be dropped in the chat box right now. The recording for this session will be available in 7 to 10 days. And please keep your eyes on the NAFSA Region 7 upcoming events page, the NAFSA Region 7 newsletter, and the social media channels as we announce other new professional development opportunities. We are all very excited about the NAFSA All Regions Summit from October 4 to 22. Registration for that will begin on August 31st, and we will be dropping a link to the NAFSA site for more information about the All Regions Summit. So we hope to see you there. Thank you again to all of you, to the audience, and to the presenters. Have a great evening and a great weekend. And thank you to Hillsborough Community College for sponsoring this absolutely wonderful event.